Welcome to the Complete React Beginner tutorial, in which I will take you from a complete beginner to knowing how to build a beautiful and intuitive quiz app. You will find the code and all of the video resources below so you can follow along as we code. But before we start building the project, I want to briefly go over some important React concepts so you'll learn how to start thinking in React. React is a powerful JavaScript library developed by Facebook for building user interfaces. It allows us to create dynamic and interactive web apps by breaking our UI down into smaller, reusable pieces called components. The first thing you need to know about React is that we return UI using a language called JSX. Even though the name sounds confusing, it is very simple to understand. JSX is just a mix of JavaScript embedded into some HTML. For example, if I wanted to display this piece of UI that I'm showing on the screen that renders a simple h1 tag saying my name, it looks pretty much like a normal HTML. But with JSX, I can directly inject JavaScript into the UI to make it such that I can use a variable as my name and the UI will adapt accordingly. Now, the way that we return this UI is through a return statement inside a component. So what exactly is a component? Well, a component is just a normal JavaScript function, but instead of returning strings, numbers, or booleans, it returns JSX UI. Think of components as the building blocks of your application. Each component is a self-contained piece of UI, like a button, a form, or even an entire page. With components, you can easily reuse and manage your code, which makes your app scalable and maintainable. Now, how do you reuse your components? Well, you can use this little thing called props, which allows us to make a piece of the UI return different results depending on what we pass to it when we call the component. Props are how we pass data from a parent component to a child component. In React, this concept of having parents and child is very prevalent because you can actually call a component inside of another component, establishing that parent-child relationship. Now, normally web apps interact with the DOM, also known as the document object model, which represents the structure of your web page. React uses something called the virtual DOM, which is a lightweight copy of the real DOM. When your app's data changes, React will update the virtual DOM first, and then efficiently sync the changes with the real DOM. It is not that necessary to fully understand how the virtual DOM really works, especially in the beginning, so don't worry. Just know that this is the process that makes updates in React much faster and enhances overall performance. Now that we have some exposure to some of the most basic React concepts, the rest we can learn through building a real application. If you like the way I teach React and is interested in a complete in-depth course that will take you from beginner to advanced, please click the link in the description to check out my newly released full Ultimate ReactJS course. In this course, you will learn everything you need to know to consider yourself an advanced React developer by teaching you all the necessary concepts while building 4 amazing projects. If this interests you at all, click the link in the description. Now that we got that out of the way, let's learn how to set up our first React app. Okay, everyone. So again, welcome to my full React course for beginners, where we're going to be learning React by building a project. I think this is one of the best approaches for learning a new technology, even if you're not very familiar with it, because by building a project, you can utilize all the concepts you're learning in a very straightforward and understandable way. So in order to start this video, we have to set up our computer, so our operating system, to be able to handle creating a React application. The first thing that you need is Node.js or any other package manager. I personally will be using Node.js for this video, so if you don't have Node installed, you can just go ahead and go to nodejs.org or click the link that will be in the description and just download Node.js for your computer. Now, when you have Node.js installed, what you're going to do is you're going to need a code editor. I have here VS Code already opened inside of my computer, and to check to see if Node is installed in your computer, you just run node-v on any terminal, and if it gives a version, it means that you have it installed. Perfect. Now that we have our package manager installed, I want to create a folder in my computer that will hold our React project. I'm going to call this the quiz app, because this is what we're going to be building in this video. It is going to be, like I said, a very simple project, but by the end of it, you will know enough to consider yourself an intermediate React developer. So I'm going to drag and drop this folder into my VS Code, and you'll see that the project will automatically restore, and we will see that we are inside of the quiz app directory. Now, to set up our React project, I want to use something called Vite. So there's multiple different ways for you to create and launch your React projects, and throughout the years, the standard in the industry has changed. If you watch some old videos, you might see people creating their apps using a command called create React app. However, that is not currently recommended anymore. For the past 2 years, we as React developers had to migrate into different alternatives. And one of the tools that is the front runner in the market is called Vite. And Vite is just a tool that will help you build and run your React projects faster. We can use Vite to set up our React project without having to worry about generating our app file by file, which, to be honest, you don't have to know how to do that even if you're an advanced React developer. And this will facilitate us with not having to deal with all of the annoying stuff of setting up our application. To run Vite in our computer and create a React app using Vite, all we have to do is run npx create Vite. Now, with create Vite, when we run enter, you'll see that it will ask us for a project name. If you've never ran this command before, it might also ask if you want to install this command first, and you just press enter and say yes or whatever, and you will install create Vite, but then it will ask you for a project name. I want to create this project inside of the folder that I'm already inside of, so I'm not gonna give another name for another folder. I'm just gonna put a dot, which means let's create that project inside of the directory I'm inside of right now. Now, it's going to ask us to select a framework. Now, React technically is not a framework, it's a library, but that's beyond the case. Vite is not just for React. Vite actually can help you create projects with just vanilla JavaScript, with Vue, with Svelte, Solid, and many other options as well. But obviously in this video, we are learning React, so we're going to be using Vite to create our React app. So I'm going to choose React by pressing enter. Then it's going to ask us which variant of the project we want to create, if we want to use TypeScript or JavaScript or Remix or options with SWC. If I were you, I would just click on JavaScript and not even worry about the other options for now, since you are a React beginner. Now, it's done setting up a bunch of files in our computer, and I will briefly go over each of them so you guys can understand how a React project is structured. But the first thing we need to do is first run the command npm install, which will install all of the necessary packages for a project that are listed in our package.json. This will include React itself, React DOM, all of the types, and so on that are necessary for us to run our React app. Now that we have run that, you see that a node modules popped up over here with all of our modules installed. Now we want to run our React app. To run it, we just come over here and run npm run dev, and you'll see that it will generate a project and will run a project locally on the following link, http localhost 5173. We're going to copy this and we're going to go to our browser and we'll just put it over here, and you see that we have successfully ran our first React project. Now, when you use Vite to generate your React app, it gives you this little cool boilerplate project, right? With the logos for Vite and React, a title, this little counter that shows you how React is very reactive to state changes in your web app. And we're pretty much just going to delete all of this to start from scratch. But before we do that, let's go over how a React project is structured, because if this is the first time you're looking at a React project, you might be very confused with what each file means or where to put your files in the project. So the first file we see over here is the vite.config.js. This is very optional, and I wouldn't worry at all if I were a complete beginner, because you probably won't touch this until you end up way along in your journey using different libraries that requires plugins and so on. So this is just a config file for any Vite settings. It's not React specific at all, and it's just because we're using Vite to generate our application. But if you end up want to customize some stuff with Vite, and add different plugins, you would do it over here. Now, the next one is the package.json, which is obviously something that we need in any JavaScript project. You can see that the only thing that is important to understand is that when you run a React project, you need to have installed React and React DOM. Now, you see the versions I am using over here are 18.3.1. However, React already has the version 19 available to use. However, for the purposes of this video, it won't matter because the changes between the React 18 and React 19 won't make a single difference for a beginner. They're more advanced changes that you don't have to worry at all. So this is all we have to talk about the package.json. Then we have our index.html. Now, the index.html is an extremely important file because you might be wondering, why are we using HTML if this is a React project? Well, every website needs to have an HTML file that is going to be the template for your app. And every React app has an HTML file in it. Now, this HTML file is very important because it will allow us to put stuff like meta tags at the top or at the head, the title for our project, links if we want to, and stuff like that. But more importantly, every React project is just an HTML project which has a single div inside of its body called the root. Now, when I say a single div, you can put other divs over here and just add more HTML to this. But the idea is that your entire React app is going to exist inside of this root div. You see, it's the root div because it has an ID of root. So what it does is when you open a React website, it's going to just have this single div, and there's a script right next to it. And this script will run this file called main.jsx that we have in our source folder. This is a JavaScript file. And that JavaScript file, well, I'll show you in a second. It's this over here. All it does is it calls the React DOM library and the React library, and it will call this create root function inside of the element in the document with the ID root, and it will render this app component. If you remember what we talked about components, it will render this component in React called the app component. Now, basically, all it's doing is when you open your website, it is going to run this main.jsx script and inject our entire JavaScript app inside of this root div. So your entire project will be inside of this, and it will load when you load your index.html file and run the script. Now, this create root function over here will convert all of the React code that you write into code that is understandable inside of an HTML file. So that's basically how this works. Now, I'm going to close this main.jsx because that's how we start our project. But like I said, React is made out of components, and this script runs our first component, which is the app.jsx component. This is the entry point of our app. It is the main component of our app. This is where we're going to build our UI and call other components to expand our app. Now, you can see that in the current state of the code, it has a bunch of stuff inside of it, and it might resemble a lot of HTML as well. But remember, this is not HTML, this is JSX. And you can see that this is the first instance of us using a component. If you remember from the intro, a component is just a function, a normal JavaScript function that returns some JSX. So you see over here, we are returning a bunch of UI, but it's not just UI because there's some embedded JavaScript like this count variable that is defined at the top. Now we're going to ignore what this crazy looking thing is over here. If you've never worked with React, we'll deal with it later. But what we want to do is we want to delete a lot of the stuff that is over here, so we can start our project in a clean slate. I'm also going to delete all of this over here, and I'll just leave one single thing. I'm going to say hello world. Every time you make a change in React and you save it, it will automatically update the project and update the UI that you're loading in your localhost 5173. Now, what about the rest of your project? Well, there isn't much to understand. We have here two CSS files that you can use. It comes with the project, but they're not technically necessary. I'm actually going to delete this one over here and just keep one, but they're just normal CSS files. There's an assets folder in case you want to add some assets to your project. And we have this public folder over here, which can also hold assets. So that's a bit confusing for beginners. Now, the public folder is meant to hold static files that won't change, more specifically, images or icons. So the difference between storing an image like an SVG, or an icon or something like that in the public folder or in the assets folder instead of the source folder is that when you put an image on the assets folder, you can just import it directly in your code. When the static files in the public over here, you can actually access them publicly. Meaning that, for example, see this vite.svg file over here. If I actually want to access it, all I have to do is just say vite.svg, and you'll see that I'll have access to that image. But the other one over here, I can't do that. Perfect. Now we have successfully covered our entire folder structure, and our entire project, by the way, will exist inside of this source folder over here. Now let's start building our app. The first thing I want to do to start building our app is I want to write some UI elements that will help create the structure of this project. So like I said, this project will look kind of nice. It will have some CSS and styling to it, but this is a React course, a React video, so I won't be writing any of the styling. I have already written the styling, and I'll delete all of the CSS that comes with this file, and I'll just paste all of the styling that I have already written. And as we write our code, I will be referencing these styles, these class names, and the styles will be applied automatically. If you want to use the same CSS that I wrote for this video, go ahead and check the link in the description with the source code. But now let's start building this app.jsx component. So in here, I want to start by adding a div just to generate the structure of our website. In this div, I want to give a class to it, right, to reference a styling in my index.css. Now, there's two things we need to take into account. First of all, we're not actually importing the index.css here. We're importing the app.css. In React, when you want to import CSS files, you use the import statement and you put the path to that file. Now, we don't have the app.css anymore because I deleted it when we were looking at the folder structure. And we have another file called the index.css. If we want to import that one, we have to change this to index.css. Now, the second thing is, since the beginning of React, if I want to pass a class to an element, such as a div, let's pick up the first class, this app container class. Imagine I want to pass it to this div. In normal HTML, I would write class, and then I would pass here the app container. However, because React used to use the class as a keyword back in the day, and you might still see some components being created with the class instead of with a function, it became common practice to, instead of using class, for you to use class name. But in newer versions of React, if you use class and you're not used to using class name, they will not complain. But for most of React's history, you couldn't call it a class. You had to call it a class name. And for that reason, it became standard in the React code base for everyone. So I'll be using class name from now on. Now, you see that just because I assigned a class name to this div, automatically it applied some cool styling to our project. Now, inside of here, I want to give a title to this page. And to give a title, I'm just going to put an h1 tag that will say quiz app, which because our project is a quiz app, and we can see that it changed to appear the actual title. Now, what we want to do is we want to create a quiz, and that quiz is going to require a lot of different parts of the UI, right? It's going to require a place for us to select different options to answer a question, different questions, also a beginning to the quiz, an ending to the quiz with the results, and so on. All of these different parts of the UI can be condensed into different components. For example, we have here our app component, but I don't want to start writing a bunch of stuff related to the quiz right inside of here. I might as well create a component that will contain the information, the UI, the logic, and so on for the quiz. Now, to create a component for the quiz, I'll have to create a folder in my project called the components folder. And inside of this folder, I can create a file that will represent that component. I'll call it the quiz.jsx. Now, you might have noticed already that why are we using the extension called JSX instead of a JS extension? And the reason for it is because when you are creating a file in your project, your React project that will have a component inside of it, you have to make it into a JSX file. And if you have just a normal JavaScript file that has no components inside of it, you make it into a JS file. So we're going to create a component for the quiz in this file, so I'm going to call it quiz.jsx. Now inside of here, I want to create a component called quiz. Now, how do I create a component? Well, if you remember, like I said multiple times, a component in React is just a function that returns some UI. So I'll come over here and I'll write function quiz, and I'll put a return statement into it. Now, what do we want to return? Well, we need to return some UI. So for now, let me just return a div that will say quiz. Now, one thing you might have noticed as well is that I'm capitalizing this function. A good distinction for you to do when you are creating components in React, and it's common standard practice in the industry, is for you to call your component functions with a capital letter first. That's how you help yourself distinguish a normal function from a component function. Now, if I want to access this quiz component in this app.jsx file, I will need to export this function into here. And to do that, I'll just come down here at the bottom and I will export default quiz. Now, in our app.jsx, I can just import quiz from the quiz file in the components folder. And to call this quiz component inside of our app component, all I have to do is I just have to open and close this little brackets and self-close this and call the quiz name. Now you'll see that automatically whatever UI I returned from the component is displayed in the app component. In fact, I could actually reuse this component multiple times if I wanted to, and you'll see that the word quiz will appear as many times as I call this component, because the whole point of this is I'm abstracting all of this UI and logic into this component that is separate from here, and then I just have to call it like you would if you were just calling a normal JavaScript function. So this is great. We're gonna delete, obviously we're just gonna call it once. And now let's go to our quiz component over here, and let's start by doing the first thing you need to do when you are creating a quiz, which is creating the questions and the answers for your quiz. Now, the best way for us to do this is for us to have a question bank, which is just a list of different questions, the options, and their answers. So to do this, I'm going to create here a list called question bank. And this is going to be an array of objects. Now, each object will represent the information we need to know for a specific question to exist in our quiz. So what are the three things we need? We need to know what the question is. So what, for example, what is the capital of France? That's a question. Now we need to have 4 options since this is multiple choice. So I'll make a key called options, and this will be a list with the 4 different options. Like I'll put Berlin, I'll put London, I'll put Paris, which is the answer obviously, and I'll put Rome. And then finally, we need to know the answer. So I'll put an answer over here and I'll choose one of the options and I'll just put it inside of here. Now we can make the same thing, but for the other 2 options. So I'll just copy and paste it over here. And we can put the information for the other questions. For example, which language is used for web apps? Now, technically, all of these options are correct because all of them can be used for web apps. So I'm just going to choose the all option over here. And this is the answer. And the last question, I'll actually make it a question that is applicable for this video. So what does JSX stand for? And the answer is JavaScript XML, right? Now the other options are understandable too, but this is the answer. So now we have here the question bank for our project. Again, It is just a way for us to represent our questions through objects instead of a list, which has questions, options, and answers. Nice. And now that we have the question bank, we can start displaying the UI of the quiz. So for example, inside of this div that we are returning down here, this is where our UI will be displayed. We can delete this over here, and we can start by adding an h2 tag that will contain the question number that we are in. So for example, I want to say that we are in question 1. So this h2 tag will say question 1. Now below this, we're going to put a p tag, so a paragraph tag that will contain the actual question that is referencing question 1. Now, how do I do this? Well, if I wanted to just manually make this be question 1, what I could do is I could go to this question bank list, and to display the question for question 1, I can just insert some JavaScript inside of here. Because this over here is a list, right? It's a constant that is a list. And if I want to show the question string for the first question in this list, I just have to say question bank, access the first element, and access the question in it. So I could display that question by saying question bank, access the first item in the list, and then accessing the question property inside of the object. And you'll see that it will display the text in that question. Great. Now, I also want to give a class name to this paragraph tag, which will be question. And you see that some styling will be applied to it automatically. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to display all of the different options that we can select. So in order to display an option, we just have to make a button like this, like a button, that will, for example, show one of the options for the first question, like Berlin. I'll just make this be one of the options. So I'll say here, Berlin. Now to give some styling to this button, I'm going to give it a class name. And I'm going to call it option. And you'll see that automatically Berlin becomes an option that we can select. I could add another button over here, for example, for Paris, and it would look equally as good. Now, I don't want to manually go ahead and put each of the options for question 1. We have a list. So what we can do actually is we can write some very nice JavaScript code that will loop through the list of options. And for each of the elements, it will render a button. Now to do that, it's actually pretty simple. I'll just come over here and I'm going to say question bank again, access the first element in the question bank, so the first question, and I'm going to say dot options to get the list of options, and then dot map. And this map function, when called inside of a return function in a component for UI, is very important because it allows you to loop through lists and display lists in the UI that depend on specific JavaScript arrays. So I can loop through this options list and I can grab each individual option from it. Now I can return some JSX from it. And to return this JSX, I have to open and close some parentheses, just like this. Make sure the parentheses make sense. We have 2 closing and 2 opening. And then inside of here, I can return some UI like a button. Now, if I did it like this, and I delete these ones, you'll see that it will just render 4 different Berlin buttons because we are just looping through the 4 options, and for each option, we're just rendering this Berlin option. But the thing is, what if I want to change this such that instead of rendering Berlin for all of them, I want to render the actual option? Well, to do that, I can just insert this argument over here from the map function, which, by the way, when you use the map function, if you don't know, it will, all of the arguments will just be whatever each of the elements is. I can just render that option directly here, and each of the options that we have in the list will appear in the buttons. Perfect. Now, let's go below the list of options and let's add the navigation buttons. So the navigation buttons are going to be the buttons to go to a previous question or go to the next question. So I'm going to add a div over here, which I'm going to give a class name of nav buttons. Now inside of this div, we're going to put two different buttons. We're going to put a button for going to the previous question, and we're going to put another button to go to the next question. You'll see that when I go over here, the two buttons automatically appear on the left and the right, all because of the styling. Now we have our UI for the question pretty much done, but there's a problem. This is just UI. There is no reactivity to it. There's no functionality to it. I can't really select anything. And the reason for that is because in order to add this reactivity to our project or this functionality to our project, you guys have to learn a very important React concept. And that concept is a state. So I'm going to teach you guys really quickly what a state is by showing you guys an issue that you might encounter if you're trying to work without knowing what a state is. So to do that, for example, let's try to write some logic that will allow us to select one of these options, right? So how would we do that? Well, to select one of these options, we have to add an onClick to the button so that we know which option we selected. This onClick, similar to how you would normally use it in HTML, can call a function. Now we're going to create here a function called handle select option, and this function requires us to pass the option that we're trying to select. So I'm going to put here option. Now in order to call this function inside of this onClick, we actually have to do something that is a bit weird if you're not used to React. We have to open and close parentheses and then use this arrow notation. This is us creating an inline function so that we can then call this handle select option function. We only do this if we need to pass some sort of argument to this function, or else we could just pass the handle select option just like this. But because we want to pass an argument, which is the option, we have to do this hacky thing and pass the option directly into the argument. Now, when I click on it, if I pass a console log over here, you'll see that when I click on this, on the option, it will actually console log the option. Let's actually open our console log over here. And let me click on one of the options, like this or this. And you'll see that if I open my inspect, those two options were console logged. So the function is working correctly. It is getting the option correctly. Now, what if I want to make this variable, right? Let's declare this variable. Call it option selected. And initially it is none, meaning we didn't select any option, right? It's just a string saying none. Now, if I were to display it down here with a paragraph tag and say option selected is equal to, and then I can just insert this variable inside of here and it should display option selected none. You'll see that this is exactly what happens. Now, what I want to do is I want to be able to click on one of the options, call this handle select option, and then change this option selected to be whatever option we selected. And in normal JavaScript, you might expect that something like this would work, right? Setting the option selected variable to the option we selected, which by the way, you guys already know it's correct because of the console log, should select the correct option. But you'll see immediately that if I select one of the options, nothing is changing. Now, internally, the variable is changing its value, technically, but we're never telling React to re-render this component, so repaint the web page to show this new change. React has this whole concept of a component rendering and re-rendering. We want to have full control over when we want a component to change its state and re-render the page and when we don't. And if you want a component to re-render due to some variable changing, you need to make that variable become a state. So in order to create a state, you have to use your first React hook. Now, I won't be going too much into details about hooks in this video because hooks is something that you learn as more of an intermediate developer. I'll obviously teach the most basic hooks that you need to know in React. And the most basic one is called the use state hook. Now, to create a use state hook, you write const, you open and close square brackets, and you set it equal to use state. Now, a state is just a normal JavaScript variable or a normal JavaScript constant, but the difference is when you change its value to something else, React will know that it needs to re-render the page if you're using that value in the UI to show the new value and display the new value. Differently from a normal variable which just changes the value but never calls this return function again to show the new value. So to turn this constant into a state, I'll pass the name of the constant into the first element in this square bracket array, and to the second one, I'll pass a function that will be used to change the value of the state. Now, this is a bit confusing in the beginning, but you'll get used to it. This is just the name of the state, and this is just a function that we are naming. We can call it whatever we want, but we are naming this, and we're going to use this to alter the value of this. Now, we can also pass an initial value to this state. For example, we can pass none over here, and it's almost like we just created the same variable. We can delete this, and you'll see that in the UI, nothing has changed. But the difference is, now, if I click one of these buttons, still nothing changed, right? Because the thing is, you have to use this function that we defined over here to change the value. We can't just do this, right? When you have a state, you have to use this in order for the whole functionality of a state to work. So we're going to use this set option selected function over here. And if I want to set the option that we have over here as the option selected, I just call this function and I pass the new value that we want the state to be inside of the arguments. And now you see that when I click any of the options, the UI will re-render to show the option that we selected. So this is a very basic explanation of how states work, and it is important for you to understand because we're going to be using a lot of them in this video. Now let's go back to our code, and I only use this option selected state over here so I could explain to you guys what a state is, but we're actually going to make a little bit of a change in this. What we want to do instead is we're actually going to want to have a state that is going to keep track of all of the answers that the user have selected so far. So that means that if we have a quiz with 3 questions, right? We have 3 questions over here. We're going to have a state that it is going to be a list with 3 items. Now, those items in that list will represent the answers that the user gave. And at the end of the quiz, we're just going to compare if each of the answers match the answers that they should be, which are detailed in the question bank list. And if they don't match, then it means that they got something incorrect. So we're going to imagine right here, we're going to have a list, which is going to be the user, let's call it user answers, right? And this list for this question bank with 3 questions would have initially 3 items. All of them are going to be null, right? Because you haven't submitted the answer yet. But if the user goes ahead, answers the first question, and they choose Berlin, then this will be replaced with Berlin. If they go and then answer the second one, which is going to be all, then they'll answer all. And if they answer the last one and they answer correctly, then we will replace this with this. By the end of the quiz, this user's answers array, which is going to be represented in the state, is going to be filled in. And we know that the quiz is done when there's no more null values in this list. Now, what we do after that is we just compare each individual elements in the list with the corresponding answer in the question bank. So for the first item, if it's Berlin and the answer is Paris, that means it is wrong. And then that's how we're going to count. So what we want to do is we actually want to create a state similar to this over here that is going to keep track of not only the option we selected right now for this question, but also all of the options selected for all of the questions. So we're going to delete this and we're going to rewrite a new state. So we already know the format of how a state works, right? We're going to say const, open and close square brackets, set it equal to use state. But this time, this is going to be a list. Now, an easy way for us to do this is to say, create a constant here, call it initial answers, set it equal to just an array of null values. And since we know the question bank has 3 questions, then this over here is going to have 3 items. And then when we add a new question to the question bank, we add a new null value to this initial answers, and then we just pass this over here. So the array will start like this. And we're going to call this the user answers. And we'll have a function to modify it called set user answers. Now, in the handle select option, what we want to do instead is we want to get the option that we're selecting, and we want to edit or replace the item in the array that corresponds to this specific question with the option that was selected. So if this is the first question, I want to basically set this first item to be whatever this option value is. If we're in the second question, I want to do this, and if we're in the third, I'll do this. So the way we're going to do this is I need to keep track of what the current question that we're in is. Because if you look down here, we're always just manually setting 0 to get the question information. But instead of that, we should actually create a variable that will represent our current question, and it will change in value every time we click on the previous or on the next button. So a good way for us to represent which question we're in is by using numbers. More importantly, numbers that correspond to the specific index in this question bank array. So for example, I'll create here a state, and I'm going to call it current question. And I'll have a function called set current question. Now this state will start as 0 because 0 represents the first question. And I can just put this as the index of this question bank array over here every time we want to access the question. And now if I switch, so you'll see that right now it still show the first question, right? It's just erroring because we have to remove this thing over here because we don't have an option selected anymore. Perfect. Now let's go back over here. See, it's still the first question because this new state that we created called current question, it starts at 0. But now if I switch this to 1, you'll see that the question changed, right? It's the other question. And again, if I switch this to 2, now it changed. Now what happens if I switch this to 3? Well, it's actually going to break because there's only 3 questions in the array, so this is out of bounds. So this is important, and I'm telling you right now because when we deal with the navigation from going to from the previous to the next question, we have to take into account this not allowing the array to go out of bounds. So let's start with 0, which is what the first question is. Now we have an answer. What is the current question that we're in? So that means that when we handle select option, right, when we select the option of the answer we want to give for a specific question, we now have all the necessary information to be able to record in this user's answers state what was the answer selected for which question. So how would we do this? Well, first of all, remember, if I want to, this is a list, right? This user's answers. If I want to make a change to a list that is a state, I can't just manually, for example, call the push method or call the splice method or something like that. If I want to make a change to this array, I have to use the set users function. And what this function will take in is the new version of this array that we want to change it to. So what is the new version? Imagine that this over here is the first question and we want to select an answer. I basically want this user's answers array to now be like this, to be option, null, null, because we're now putting whatever option was selected into the slot for the first question. I want to put this instead of here, and this is the new version of the array. So what I want to do is, or what I have to do is, I actually want to make a copy of this user's answers array so that I can mutate that directly. So you understand what I mean by that. I'll make here a new user answers. And this array is going to be equal to basically an array with all of the entries in the current user answers, which seems redundant, I understand, but all I'm doing here is I'm just making a copy of this user answers array so that now with this new user answers array, I can actually manually mutate it by accessing the element in the position of the current question, because that's the current question we're trying to answer, and then set that equal to whatever answer was chosen, whatever option was chosen. And now, if this was for the first question, this new user answers should again look like this. So I'm going to delete this and I'm just going to pass now this new user's answers, and we have successfully selected the option for this specific question. So this is great. Now we have a very important functionality for this project setup. Now what we have to do is allow our users to go from one question to the other. So you notice that we haven't used this set current question function over here. And the way we're going to use it is through these buttons. So we have this as a number. It starts at 0, right? So if I click on the next button, it should basically set the current question to be 1. So what does that mean? It means we're incrementing this current question state by 1 every time we click on the next button, and we are subtracting 1 from this state every time we click on the previous button. So we're going to create here two functions. We're going to create the go to next, and we're going to create here the go to Prev, which is go to previous. Now, what these two functions will do is, let's start with the go to next. What I want to do is, I just want to set the current question to be whatever it is right now. So current question plus 1. So if it's 0, it will become 1. If it's 1, it will become 2. Now for the go to Prev, I need to do the same thing, but subtract 1. But the problem with this is that what if it starts at 0, which is the case, right? Do we want to go to -1? Well, no, we don't. So I want to check if current question is greater than 0. That's the only scenario in which we want to allow a user to be able to go to the previous question. We'll also disable the button if it is on the first question, but this is an important check to also make. So now that we have the two functions done, we can go down here and I can just pass an onClick to each of them. So I'll pass an onClick to the next and pass the go to next function, which, if you remember, I explained to you guys, if there's no arguments that I need to pass to the function, like I was doing over here, I don't need to make this inline function over here. I can just pass the name directly. And I'll do the same thing for the previous. I'll just paste it over here and say go to previous, and perfect. Now, like I said, I want to disable the previous button from being clicked if you're in the first question. And similarly, I want to disable going to the next question if you haven't selected an answer for the question you're in right now. So I only want to allow you to go to the next question if you've selected a question, or an answer. So in this one over here, I'm going to pass the disabled property that buttons have, and I'm actually going to pass a Boolean inside of here that is going to say if we want this button to be disabled or not. The only situation in which we want this button to be disabled is if the user is currently in the question 0, meaning they're in the first question. So we can put this logic over here saying current question is equal to 0. And then what you'll see is that now it is disabled. But if I click on this, it should go to the next question and everything should adapt. And if I click on this, it should go to the next one as well. Now, if I click on previous, it should go back until we get to the first question. Now, that's working perfectly. But what happens if I go to the last question? Breaks, because we're not handling the fact that it reached the end of the list. So how do we handle that? Well, first of all, I want to disable this button if the user hasn't selected an option yet, which is something that we've mentioned. Now, let's think about this objectively. How do we know if a user selected an option for the current question? Well, the way we know is if in this array over here, right, the user answers array, if for the item on the corresponding spot for the current question is null, it means they haven't selected yet. Because if they select something, this gets replaced or this gets replaced with the option that was selected. And what we can do is we can create here an actual variable that will keep track of the current selected answer for this specific question. So we have the list of all the options that were selected, all of the answers for all the questions, and we have the current question. So we just want to know if in this current moment, what is the selected answer for the current question. So we'll create this variable called selected answer, and we'll set it equal to the user answers array, and we'll get the option at the current question. So this means that if we haven't answered this question yet, the selected answer over here will be null. But if we have selected it, then it will be whatever we passed, whatever we selected, right? Because then we will insert the option over here and it will be something. Meaning that if this selected answer variable over here is null, it means we haven't selected an answer yet. So over here on this next button, I can pass a disabled property over here, and I can say that it is disabled if selected answer is not equal to null. Or an easier way to write this is to say if not selected answer, just like this. And you'll see that I can't go next or previous because I haven't selected anything yet. But if I select one, this automatically appears. Now it disappears again. I can select one and I go next, and then I can select one and then it breaks the app. But that's cool. Now we have a lot of this logic set up. Now, before we deal with the breaking of the app, I want to deal with one thing. I added some cool styling for when you select one of the options. So like when you select, for example, London, right now there's no indication that you selected London. And I thought this would be a good practice for you guys for you to understand how to interact states with CSS, which is something that you can definitely do and you do a lot in your coding. So you see this button over here, right? The button for selecting options. So in this button over here, I gave it a class name and I called it option. And this part of the video is optional just because I don't know if you're using the same CSS as I am, but if you look at the CSS for this project, here is a class called option, right? You'll see that there's one version of option, which is the normal one, and there's also another version of option. It's a version where it also has a class name called selected, and it has some cool styling when the div or whatever element is using it has also the selected class name to it. So what I want to do is, if this button was selected, I don't want the class name to just be option. I want it to also be option and selected, like this. Because if that's the case, then we apply this cool styling to the button that makes it blue, but not in this case because all of them looks the same. So I want to write some logic here that will add that selected class name to this class name property over here, to this class, if this current option inside of this button was selected. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing you need to understand is what are we doing here, right? To recap what we're doing here. We're just looping through the options of the current question in the question bank. So for the current question, we're just looping through the list that has Berlin, London, Paris, and Rome. So for each instance of this button, this option variable argument over here is going to be a different value. It's going to be, for a moment, is going to be Berlin. For another iteration, is going to be London. For another one, is going to be Paris, and so on. So what I can do is I can actually check over here. I can add this curly braces, which means I'm going to be adding some JavaScript to this class name. Now, the JavaScript I want to add is, so we want to set the class name to have option. For sure, it's going to have option because no matter what, it's going to have this as the class name. But then I want to add the other part of the string, this selected part of the string. When I add these two strings together, it becomes the version that is all blue, right? But I only want to add this part if the selected answer, meaning the answer for the current question is equal to the option in the current iteration. Meaning that if there's a list of options and one of those options I selected, then I want to add this selected string to the end. So what I can do is I can add here a conditional using ternary operators, which is a JavaScript concept. I can basically add that if the selected answer is equal to the option, then let's add this selected thing to the end of this. If not, then let's actually just add an empty string, which will basically just add nothing. It will make it such that option is the only thing that is selected. And you'll see that when we do this, now, depending on what we select, that's the only thing that has the selected class name. You'll see that if I open the inspect element over here and I open for the option over here, you'll see that as I click on the different options, the class name selected keeps switching from which button it is. So it will apply the correct styling. Perfect. Now we have almost everything we need to be able to get done with this project. Now, what I need to do is I need to deal with what happens when we get to the end, which is this part over here. When we get to the end, instead of seeing next on this button, I actually want to see a finish quiz label to it. I don't want to see next because it's the end of the quiz. So I want to see finish quiz so that I can click on it and open the results for the quiz. So the way we can do this is very simple because we know what the length of the quiz or the question bank is, right? This is the array. So we know what the length of this is and we know what the current question is. So all we have to check is if the current question is on the last question, then we know that the button should say finish quiz. If it's not on the last question, then it should say next. By the way, if you see all these annoying things, ignore it, okay? It's not it's not important. But yeah, so for the next over here, this next button, we have to make that distinction. So there's two options, next and finish quiz. So we're going to have to use some JavaScript to make that connection, to check to see if the current question is equal to the last item. Now, to check to see if it is the last item, we have to get the length of the question bank and subtract that by 1. If the current question is equal to that, then it is the last question. And then, if that's the case, then we want to display finish quiz. And if that's not the case, we want to display next. But the thing is, even like now, this is inside of a JavaScript statement. So this over here doesn't make sense. It makes sense if we turn it into a string. So now it's just rendering this string inside of this button label if this is the case, and if not, it will render this. You'll see that if I go back to the question, since we're in the last question, it will say finish quiz, and nothing happens yet. When I click that, we will handle the results page, but you'll see that on the other ones, it doesn't. One thing I quickly noticed that we haven't fixed is it should say question 1, question 2, and question 3 as we move through the exam. So the way we do that is I change this to say current question instead of just a static number. And you'll see that now it still looks kind of weird because remember, this is actually something that I forgot. Current question is not technically a human-like representation of the current question. It represents the current question in the sense of a position in an array. So the first item in an array is 0, but question 1 is 1. So what we can do is just add this by 1 so that it looks more like something a human would write instead of a programmer. And as you can see, it works perfectly. We get to the last question and I can click on finish quiz. So we're almost done with most of the project. We just now want to show the results for when users finish the quiz. So how are we going to do this? Well, in order to show the results of the quiz, I want to actually separate that logic from this component. Because if you think about it, you want to structure your project into different parts, so different components that are self-contained, meaning the logic in each of them is independent from each other and they are contained inside of the component. So it wouldn't make sense, in my opinion, to put the logic or the UI for their results in this component over here, because we can easily just contain that into a different component and display all of that in there. Especially because one thing that I think is important for you to understand is that the UI you return in a component should be the UI for that specific component. So if you see here, we are returning a piece of UI that represents the quiz. So if we were also to return the results UI, it would kind of steer away a little bit from what the purpose of this component is. So that's why I think it would be good for us to add another component called the results component. So I'm going to create here another component, which you remember, you just have to create a file. We're going to call it results.jsx. And inside of here, we're going to create a function called result or results. And we're going to return some sort of UI. For now, I'll just put a div and we'll leave it like that. Now down here, I want to export default results. Now, let's build the UI for this results component a little bit. So in this component, I want to just show a little title that will say quiz completed or something like that. So I'm going to put an h2 tag that will say quiz completed. Then I want to have a paragraph tag that will show your score. So we're going to put a p tag over here and we're going to say your score. And we don't have the data right now, the access to the data of what the user score is. But for now, just for simplicity reasons, I'll put some hard-coded score. So 2 out of 3. Then below this, we want to add a button that will allow you to restart the quiz. So I'm going to add a button over here. We're going to add a label that will say restart quiz. And I want to add a class name to it that will say restart button. Perfect. Now, I just want to see how this component will look like. Now, right now, we can't really see because we're not currently calling that component. We created it, but we haven't called it yet. So what I'll do is on this app.jsx, just momentarily, I'll put it over here. We'll put the results component here. We'll call it, but we're also going to need to import it. So I'm going to say import results, and it will import the component. You see that now it will show quiz completed at the bottom with the UI for the score and the restart quiz button. Now, we don't want to show this at the same time as the quiz. We only want to show this when the user actually goes ahead and completes the quiz and clicks on the finish quiz button. So technically, we don't want to show the quiz component and the... Now, what we want to do is we want to use the information of the score from the information that we gather on the quiz component and allow it to be accessed on the results component. So right now we're hard coding the score, right? It says 2 out of 3, but we want to actually get that data. First of all, this 2 over here we'll get from the score of how many they were correct. And the 3 we're going to get from the length of the question bank, right? Because it's the amount of questions we have. So in order to do that, how would we do it? Because if you think about it, the state for the amount for the questions and the amount of correct questions, it's all inside of the quiz component, but we need to have access to it on this results component. So what I can do is I can actually not call this results component over here. Instead, inside of this quiz component over here, I can go to where we return the UI, right? You see, we're returning the quiz in this UI. But technically, we could return something else. We could return, for example, just a div here that says hello. And whatever comes first, whatever's returned first, is the UI that is going to display on the screen. So what I can do is I can check here with an if statement. I can check if we are now at the end of the quiz, then we want to return the result component. So if we get to the end of the quiz, and this is a condition we'll put over here, we are going to be not returning the quiz, we're going to be returning whatever UI we put on the results. So what we can do is we can create a state somewhere here that is going to keep track of if we finish the quiz or not. So we'll do this over here. We'll say if, we'll say is quiz finished. That's a good name for a state. And we're going to create a function called set is quiz finished. Now this state will be a Boolean because it is, just by the name you can recognize it, but it would be a true or false statement that determines if the quiz has finished or not. Initially, obviously, it will be false. But then, in this if statement over here, we're going to put if the quiz is finished, then we want to see the results. But when is the quiz finished, right? It is finished when you answer all the questions and you get to the end and you see the finish quiz button. So what we can do is we can actually go to the go to next function we have over here, and we can add some logic to this that is going to check to see if it's on the last question. And if it is, then we know not to click on the button to go to the next question, but to actually finish the quiz. So how do we know that? Well, over here, we already know the conditional that will let us know if we are on the last question. It is this over here. So we're going to copy this. And we're going to go to this go to next function, and we're going to add an if statement. If the current question is the last question, then we don't want to increase the current question by 1. We want to set is quiz finished to true. Now, if it's not the last question, then we will increase the number. If you don't make this into an if else, it is going to do both things, which might run into the same issue we were seeing before where the current question is out of the bounds of the array. So now what we can see is that if we get to the last question, we should click on the button to finish the quiz. It is going to be true, this conditional. It is going to set the is quiz finished to true. And then this if statement over here is going to automatically return the results instead of whatever UI is over here. You'll see that this is exactly what happens. Let me refresh this. Let's answer some of the questions. And you see that when I get to the last one and I click finish quiz, the UI automatically replaces with the results page. Now for this restart quiz button over here, we're going to use that same state called set is quiz finished together with restarting the current question selected and all of that kind of stuff as well. Now, inside of the results component, we're currently hard coding the score, right? So in order to have access to the actual current score, we have to have access to the question bank and also all of the answers that were selected so that we can compare all the answers that were selected by the user with the correct answers. Now, those two pieces of information exist on this quiz component, right? We have the question bank over here, right? And we also have the state that represents the user answers existing inside of this component as well. So if I want to pass data from a parent component, which the quiz component is, to a child component, which is the results component, and remember, a parent and child relationship in components just means that the results component is a child of the quiz because it is called inside of the quiz. Similar to how the quiz component is a child of the app because the app calls it. Now, I ask you this as a question, what is the relationship between the app component and the results component? Well, we call that a grandchild relationship because the results component is called inside of the quiz component, which is then called inside of the app component. So if we want to pass data from the quiz component to the results component, we can use something that we learned in the beginning of the video called using props. Now, props is basically the same thing as you would do with a normal function where you can pass arguments to it, but props is a little bit different, and it is representing the word property, right? You're passing something from a component to a component that you're calling. So the information we want to pass to this results component is we want to pass the user answers and the question bank. So what I can do is I can come to the results component and I can pass the user answers just like this, and I can define that I'll pass it through this object over here, and then I'll just put the state. This is the name of the prop that we're passing, and this is the value that we're passing. Now, down here, if I also want to access the question bank, I'll do the same thing. I'm going to call it question bank, and I can pass the question bank. Now, in this results component over here, to access the props that I passed over here, I can grab the names that I used to define those props and destructure it directly from the argument of this component. I know for a fact I'm going to pass a question bank and a user answers, so I can grab them from here. And you'll see that if I come over here and I console log both values inside of this component, you'll see that when we actually finish the quiz and I inspect the element over here, I'll get the console log with the correct data. So we are correctly passing in data from the parent component, which is the quiz, to the results component. So now what do we do with this? Well, again, I want to calculate the score of the user. We know this value of the score, the 3, because that's just the length of the questions. So how many questions are there? And we can get that by just saying questionbank.length. So you'll see that automatically it continues being 3 because that's the length of that array. But this part over here is what changes. It depends on the user answers. So we want to create a variable called score that it is going to keep track of the amount of answers that were correct. So I'm going to actually set this equal to a function called getScore. We're going to create this function right here. So I'm going to say function getScore, and we're going to create this function. And this function is going to use this user answers to calculate that information. And then in the end, it is going to return the final score. So I'm going to create a variable inside of this function called final score. And it's not going to be a const, sorry about that. It's going to be a let, so we can change it. And it's going to start at 0 because initially the user has no score yet. They haven't gotten one question correctly. So what I'll do is I'm going to loop through all of the user answers, and I'm going to compare their answers with the corresponding answer in the question bank. Because if you remember, in the question bank, we kept track of what the right answer is. So to do that, I'm going to loop through the array. So I'm going to say user answers dot for each. For each will allow us to get the answer and the index of the element in the array. And for each element in this array, I want to check to see if the answer that they gave is equal to the corresponding correct answer for this question on the question bank. Then I'll increase the final score by 1. Now, how do I know if what the correct answer is? Well, the index over here should let us know, because we can just access that by saying question bank index and then accessing the answer. Now, if that's true, by the end of this, it should give us the final score, and then we'll set that score to this variable called score, and we can just pass it over here. Now, this is a JavaScript variable, so I have to put it with curly braces, and we should see that whatever answer we gave, let's actually try this again. I'm going to choose the correct answers now. Let's just Paris 1. Actually, let's do a 1 out of 3. When I finish the quiz, you should see that it registered my score as 1 out of 3. Now let's try with answering all of them correctly. I'm going to say Paris, then all, and then JavaScript XML. You'll see that it correctly registered my score as 3 because it is looping through our answers and counting how many of them match the correct answer on the question bank. Great. Now we're pretty much almost done. The only thing I would want to do left is allow the ability for restarting the quiz. Now to do that, we want to create a function somewhere here called restart quiz. Then this function is going to be pretty simple. To restart a quiz, we need to think about what is the information we need to declare the quiz as at a clean state, right? What happens with all of our states when the quiz hasn't been started yet? Well, the first thing is we want to change the current question value to be 0, right? Because we're at the end of the quiz. So this current question state is now at the last question. So we want to restart it to 0. And the second thing is I want to restart the set users answers array back to the initial answers, which is just an array with no values. I want to restart it to its initial value. In the most basic sense, I want to restart all of the values of each of these states that we created back to their initial values. So there's two ways of doing this. One way is I can have this restart function, restart quiz function inside of the results, and then to have access to modifying the states, I could pass as a prop all of these functions to my results component. I could, for example, pass the set user answers function and the other ones as well. But instead of that, I don't want to pass all of those props. I would much rather grab this function called restart quiz out of the results component, make it exist on our quiz component, and now I automatically have access to all of the states because it's on the quiz component, and then just pass the restart quiz function as a prop to the results component, which is an interesting thing because a lot of people don't know. You can pass functions as props to other components. And this is very helpful in many different scenarios. But in this case, you see, we now have access to that restart quiz function as a prop. So instead of creating it here, I'll just grab it at the top and I'll call it when we click on this button. I'll just call it. Now we have to actually write the logic for it. So let's do that. How do we reset all of these states? First of all, to reset the user answers state, I'll just use the set user answers function and set it equal to initial answers because that's the initial state anyways. So I'll do that. Perfect. We now resetted the user answers state. Now the second one is the current question. Its initial value is 0. So I'm just going to come down here to restart quiz and I'm going to set the current question to 0. The last one is the is quiz finished. And initially it's false. Then it becomes true when we finish the quiz. But now we want to go back to false. So I'll come down here and I'm going to set this equal to false. You'll see that now when I go ahead and click on this restart quiz button, it should restart our quiz with all of our states at its initial value. And then we can go ahead and answer all of the questions again. And you see I just answered everything incorrectly, but we can finish the quiz and restart it as we want. So this is basically all the functionality I wanted to include for this project. So this is basically all the functionality I wanted to add to this project. I think this project is a cool project because it is a little bit more complicated than the normal to-do list apps and counter apps that you would see on any other video, but it also is very good looking, as you can see, and it is very intuitive for you to understand. In my opinion, it is totally okay if you still don't think you could build this from scratch. That's not the point of this. I think by the end of this video, right, my expectation for you right now is that you have now understood or at least got some exposure to a lot of different React concepts that you previously had no idea about. So even if you can't go ahead and rebuild this all from scratch without watching this video or looking at the code again, you now can start doing something on your own, and at least you'll have the knowledge that like, oh, maybe I need a state, and you might have an idea what a state is. Or maybe you'll be like, oh, I can transform this into a component. And now you know that a component is just a function that returns JSX. So I wanted this video to be a complete introduction to complete beginners, and I don't want it to treat you guys as like, you know, oh, let's build this like super simple thing, because if I'm honest, no matter how beginner you are, the difference between you going from not knowing React and completely mastering React is just time and practice. So I think giving you guys exposure to a slightly more complicated project like this one might help you get there faster. Now, if you're interested in going into each topic that you need to learn in React individually and you enjoy the way that I teach, I highly recommend you checking my newly released React course. This is the first time I release a fully owned React course myself, which I had the ability to fully formulate and outline step by step in a format that I believe that you guys will learn the best. I'll take you from not knowing React at all to being able to build a very advanced React app. And if you are struggling with learning React, maybe you need a little bit of more guidance and step-by-step outline of what you need to learn in order to get to the next step of your journey. If you're interested in checking it out, the link for it will be in the description. I'm going to be giving it completely away to 10 people who sign up to my newsletter, who's going to be in the description together with the course. So if you haven't signed up yet, go ahead and sign up, and you might be one of the winners. But again, thank you so much everyone for watching this video. Check out the links that I'll put in the description. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I see you guys next time.